Welcome to the Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today we got Tom Thorpe with us, an experienced historian, tour guide, and a fellow podcaster. We're going to get into combat morale and the will to fight, what it is, why it matters, and how it's shaped by history. So, welcome to the show, Tom. Could you tell us a bit about your background and your research in this area?
Yes, it's great to be on the podcast. I interviewed both of you on different podcasts. I'll make a plug for my own. I've done some stuff in the First World War and a podcast called the Combat Motivation Podcast, which is hardly an imaginative title, but it sort of does what it says on the tin. And my interest is really around motivation, morale, will to fight. What makes individuals fight or not fight? I think they're both really important and interesting topics. And what factors shape that? Is it institutional? Is it about beliefs? Is it about ideology? Is it about interpersonal relationships? So that's really something I became very interested in. I did a PhD in defence studies at King's College London, and I looked at small group cohesion in the 56th Division during the First World War. So that is a London raised formation in which my paternal grandfather served, and he was an infantryman, served in a unit known as the Kensingtons or 13th London Regiment. So that was an infantry battalion drawn from West London, and it's really got me into thinking about what made him A, enlist, and B, cope with his service of nearly 3 years until he was wounded in August 1918. So that's really sort of, in a way, what's driven me to think, well, this is fascinating, and how people actually, when we talk about motivation, well, what do we mean, and how ultimately does it shape combat outcomes? Because there's a lot of talk about saying it's really important and it, it's a decisive factor in war, but very few people actually think about how it interacts with other factors and what value is it, and is it a uniform or a constant value, or does it change by different conflicts, different types of combatant, different types of factors? And it's something which I think is often raised as a great factor, but nobody really looks at it, how it shapes outcomes on the battlefield.
Thanks so much for that, Tom. And as you mentioned, I've been on your pod a couple of times, and it's an absolute pleasure. In fact, that was the first podcast that I ever was on, right? So firstly, thank you for that. And of course, we will add everything in the show notes, and I'll be cheeky and put the one where Max spoke about 788 and one of my history books, which is gathering dust on a shelf on a library somewhere. But coming back to this and your research on combat morale, are there any factors that you find come up again and again, whether for good or bad, and that might be perhaps in different situations or contexts?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. Are they universal? Is there a universal soldier like Unisol, that film back in the 90s, where you get these sort of universal soldiers who are sort of augmented human combatants? And is there such thing as the universal soldier motivated by universal factors? So is a Greek hoplite the same as a medieval knight who might be the same as a samurai warrior? And you can reduce it in some ways to say broad factors which are common to all those groups, such as small group cohesion, leadership, some form of maybe ideological religious motivation. But, that sort of reduces it to a very sort of, I think, simplistic level in some ways. And I think we have to be really careful about that. Is an Islamic fighter the same as a Christian knight, for instance? And they both have universal factors. And what we stress and what we think is important is often, is shaped by sort of intellectual and academic fads. For instance, ideology was very important during the Victorian era. Ideas such as God, patriotism, etc. And then after the Second World War, everybody's talking about small group cohesion as being the real factor, and ideology really doesn't matter. And that really continues through the 1980s. And again, it's very sort of specific to some countries where people, for instance, the Americans during the 80s and 90s really thought cohesion was really important. And so I think there are universal factors, but they're always shaped by context, environment, and situation. And I think we've got to be really careful in, for instance, looking and assuming that certain factors that motivate, say, Western European soldiers might motivate, say, Russian soldiers. And that is really dangerous, because if we start doing that and don't understand the complexities in what shapes people in societies, we lose really sort of any sort of sense of meaning and understanding what actually drives them on the battlefield.
I think it's a really interesting discussion, and especially right now with the war in Ukraine. I mean, combat morale has always been a key factor, but now we can really see how it plays out in real time on the battlefield. And while the fundamentals haven't really changed, we're able to get a much clearer picture of how these factors apply today. And a lot of the research from the First and Second World Wars still holds up, and we can see that there are clear similarities.
Definitely.
So I was thinking about leadership. How important is leadership when it comes to combat morale? And do you have any examples from your studies?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think leadership's a really interesting area. I mean, it's a topic of certain Western European fashion. Leadership's very trendy, and you've got sort of, everybody talking about management and all the things that shape people in the civilian workplace. And I think it is a key factor in warfare, certainly from my studies of the First World War. But I think what's really interesting is it's very much shaped by social convention, social norms, ideals of masculinity. And, for instance, in the First World War, the two factors which really make effective leaders are personal leadership, personal courageous leadership, leading your men over the top, and also paternal care. So looking after your soldiers' welfare. Again, this isn't rocket science. But then again, you've also got this whole sort of dimension of the idea of the gentleman. So this is a Western European British ideal where a gentleman is certainly of certain social standing. He is of probably the upper echelons of society. He behaves in a certain manner. He's got a certain accent, and he conducts himself with certain social mores. And he's got this sort of idea. And even though you see there's a change in the British leadership corps during the Second World War, the type of officer that becomes a junior combat regimental leader, second lieutenant captain at the regimental level, even by 1918, is drawn from a social caste in Britain that they would never been an officer before the war. But they're still taught how to behave as a gentleman at the various training colleges they go, to use the right knife and fork, to pass the port and things like this, and the conventions of being a gentleman. And so this still, you might think this is all rather odd. Why does this matter to the average British soldier? But it does. People comment about how certain officers have a lower class accent, and they're laughed at, and it seems very odd to us today, but it really is important in that sort of sense. So leadership's often very, I think, dependent on social values and concepts at the time. For instance, would a female second lieutenant in 1914 have any traction with the soldiers when women didn't even have the vote? That's completely different, 100 odd years later. So it's really interesting. And then I think leadership is fundamentally important in cohesion and motivation. But it's not the only thing. But, to understand it is really, you need to understand the society from which these leaders and followers are drawn.
I think that's an interesting one. And when you draw the line back like that, I would think, I agree with you, and I would go even further back in the British tradition, because it tends to lend from the ancient Greeks for a start. There's this kind of link to the classics, Leonidas, what happens at Thermopylae, and this idea, which, to many is the foundation. And obviously, in this podcast, we always use extremely broad strokes and sometimes make up a thing or two just to keep everyone on their toes. But, going all the way then through to Nelson, Wellington, they are big leaders, and it just feels, I don't know if you have any thought, like, there's a bit of a cult of personality built around this heroic model that you've mentioned, that Max had just touched on too.
Yes, I mean, I think that's interesting. But Nelson, in a way, is his leadership very much a thing of his legacy rather than him at the time? I think there's lots of evidence to suggest he really did lead by example. He was personally incredibly brave. He was also very reckless in many ways. But also, it's a concept and an ideal which is erected very much after the time, and we all love to lionize him and think he's wonderful. It's a bit like the Churchill cult you get in Britain. They'd never really think about the complexities of Churchill's leadership and all the mistakes he made. But I think also it's about, I suppose, historic construction, but also this sort of, leadership is really fundamentally about personal relationships and sort of leaders who are removed from their men, their staff officers, their higher echelon. Certainly in the First World War, you get a lot of disconnect between the staff officers and the people who are trying to plan and run the war and the regimental command, the people at the sharp end. And often the sort of the feelings of the men in the front line are very, very anti the staff. And actually that unifies both officers and men in conducting covert acts of resistance against the staff. So it's a fundamentally complex and difficult thing to talk about.
Absolutely. And when we think about some of those people, I think John Keegan said simplified for this, but I kind of get it. The first act of leadership is being present with soldiers and in wherever it was. And I think Churchill had it. Nelson certainly, he died he died in the battle, right? And in one of those reckless acts that you mentioned, which was incredibly brave and won the day. And of course, even myself, I'm a little bit, but taken by that kind of myth. But I want to put that into a geostrategic context and situation. And you find, Tom, that geostrategic element also helps shape morale and motivation?
Yeah, definitely. I suppose it's what we mean by a geostrategic situation. And the historical evidence suggests that there's sort of a contradiction. For instance, if you're in a situation where you believe that you are losing, it can stiffen morale. You see after the British actions at Mons and Lecato in sort of 1914, that people get the news and they realise the British army is being defeated and pushed back. And that leads to a large number of people actually enlisting in September 1914. And then you've also got the other country's situation. If you're in a situation which is not really working, you're feeling that a lot of your sacrifice is pointless, it can lead to a real breakdown in morale. I suppose the situation in Vietnam from 1969 to 1972, when the US was pulling out, and lots of men in Vietnam and in various parts of it were thinking, what's the point of me going into action if my death is fundamentally pointless because we're leaving? And so that sort of it's how it's perceived by soldiers. And also it's also dependent on what do they know, because a lot of soldiers don't care and don't really know what's going on in the wider world. And so it's often that they're shaped by what they think is happening rather than what actually is happening or what their leaders want them to happen. Some very interesting stuff that came out of John Spencer's work. John Spencer is obviously an expert in urban combat, and he was talking to me about the motivation of soldiers in Iraq in 2003 and then in later campaigns when he was there. And he was talking about how unit cohesion was much stronger in 2003, but by 2007, people's worlds were very much shaped by what was going on at home with their families, because they were on their Facebook talking to their loved ones back home. So the geostrategic environment often didn't really matter to them. It was their own personal world that their children were doing, their wives were doing. And the fact is they had all these connections with these individuals, these personal relationships through their, devices. And so they were getting very involved with their relationships, their families missing them, their kids having problems at school, where in conventional conflicts, they probably would have known far less about that. So, sort of people's geostrategic situation really can shape their morale. And it's very much dependent on the situation. We assume that, victory breeds victory, but defeat can also stiffen morale. So it's a really interesting, complex dynamic that obviously varies from place to place. But I think geostrategic situation does shape morale. That in many ways you could argue that the Nazis during 44-45 were facing known defeat, but they carried on fighting to the bitter end because they knew that defeat was going to be worse than anything that might happen to them. So, it's not necessarily given that, knowing a bad geostrategic situation leads to I suppose, degradation in your morale at the time.
Quick pulse check. Are we on target? Drop a review on your app and hit subscribe on YouTube. Every click helps to keep the momentum going. Let's move ahead. That social aspect you mentioned is really interesting, Tom. And I guess, unfortunately, I'm old enough to have seen both sides of it. On my first deployments, we didn't have that kind of constant connection soldiers have today. It was more, letters and the occasional phone call. So it's a very different dynamic now. And on my most recent deployment, I had the feeling that you couldn't just stay in that combat bubble and focus entirely on the mission, because you're constantly connected to home, getting messages about family issues, kids having problems at school, and all of that seeps in eventually, which in some ways is good. I mean, being completely out of the loop for months and then suddenly coming home, that will be a bit strange. But at the same time, I think it's something modern armed forces haven't fully adapted to yet. The social media, instant communication, and of course, it even comes to threats reaching out to families and all of that. These all play into that morale in ways that didn't exist before. But beyond the individual level, combat morale doesn't just affect soldiers. It can shape entire battles and the outcome of them. Do you have any examples where morale and the will to fight were the deciding factors in winning or losing?
Yes, I mean, that's a really interesting question. Essentially, how does morale shape outcomes? And I think that is a really interesting thing. I mean, there's lots of examples. Having combat morale, having high levels of motivation don't necessarily lead to victories. You could argue that the British efforts on the Western Front from 1914 all the way up to maybe 1918 are examples of lots of people going over the top and getting killed because they don't know how to fight. French attacks in 15 where they lose, 1 million men. It's that sort of, idea that, going forward and the will to fight equals victory. You've got to know how to fight as well as the will to fight. But then again, you can obviously point to examples where the units have completely lost their will to fight. France in 1940, maybe Vietnam from 69 to 72, where a lot of US units are really not particularly motivated to do anything. And I think the evidence might suggest that you certainly will lose without morale, but having morale doesn't necessarily mean that you will win.
Yeah, I think those events when you have the term fracking that comes from Vietnam, I believe, right? And that's clearly some sort of, I don't have the evidence to say it's only morale related. It could also be discipline related. It could be, some other kind of motivation. But it's just crazy to think about it, right? How a term like that comes into being from soldiers killing their officers.
Yes, very much. I did a really interesting podcast with a guy who'd written a very interesting study of fragging in America. And he's really talking very, very few incidents, really. A relatively small number of men are dying, but it's more about the impact it creates on the command climate that, the officers become very wary of their men, soldiers, put their demands forward, and it creates a really sort of, I suppose, uneasy relationship, which has a massive impact on morale and how units function. Actually, they cease to function based on trust. It all becomes mutual suspicion, and that has a really derogatory impact on the efficiency of units.
Yeah, in the Congo, before what's happened recently, in this last few months or weeks, where things have escalated in Goma, there was an incident that happened I think it was in Beni, also Eastern Congo, where there was the first South African officer who was a guy that I knew, and he was a great guy, who was unfortunately was killed by what we assume is the American equivalent of fragging. And the investigation is ongoing, but it was really quite shocking for a lot of us that had served in this, in this military, and also with him in particular, he was very well known as a fighter, and he had a great reputation. Whatever happened there, will come out with the investigation, but it does leave a lot of us pretty just grumpy about it. But it also brings it all home that it can happen anywhere. It's such a complex relationship, what you had just mentioned there, Tom, between people in a combat zone.
Very much so, and it's all based on trust. And we always assume that, it certainly happened during the First World War and probably the Second World War, and probably happened in British units, but it was generally quite rare. But when you start to have a breakdown in trust, and you see a lot of people now have significant distrust in institutions, in police force, and if we were at war, God forbid, how would that mitigate and how would that replicate across the institution of the military? And it really does, make you think it can happen in British forces, it can happen in the French units. And it's really quite worrying that, societal weaknesses will be reflected in the military if and when we have to fight. And maybe I'm being a bit, I suppose, thinking, am I sort of saying something which may not happen? But it does make you think that trust is something so important, and it's critical for leadership, and it's critical for motivation. And without that, units just collapse.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say you're saying anything alarmist there, Tom, because I was shaken when I heard this. And when, Tola Peters was his name, and edited book that I'm putting together, we're dedicating to him. It's on peacekeeping and peace enforcement in Africa, and we're dedicating it to him. I also want to mention there were, I think, 14 South African soldiers killed in the recent one, so we also, pay tribute to them. The first one that I'm mentioning about Tola, it's just what you had said there, how many colleagues, that some still serving and myself and others not there anymore, just all spoke how shocking it is. It might be just a few bad elements, and not a complete breakdown, but it does shock one, right? Like, because I would have never imagined that while I was serving. And Max, I'm not sure if that was something that was ever present in your mind or even close to it.
Yeah, definitely. And I was just sitting here thinking back to different units I've served in throughout my career. And in larger, infantry-style mechanized units of platoon or company size, you usually get that strong cohesion within the unit. There might be, of course, some bad elements, but overall the unit holds together well. But when it comes to special forces units, it's different. You work in these tight-knit teams, just 3 to 6 guys. But the distrust outside of those teams can be intense. So you end up with several strong teams within the larger unit, but they don't trust each other, which creates a whole different dynamic. And I think that kind of distrust weakens morale on a larger scale. So yeah, I've thought about it and I've experienced it firsthand.
And it's something we assume won't happen in our armed forces, but I think we need to be really, really careful and don't take that on assumption, because it can happen. And it certainly has in the past, and certain units, certainly some of the SAS units we're told in Afghanistan, certainly were doing things which were causing a lot of their colleagues significant concern. Again, there's still a lot of evidence to collect, and I wouldn't want to judge the outcomes, but the evidence that I've heard on the radio is not positive. And certainly Australian forces may well have had similar issues. But again, that creates elements when you have motivation in certain units which goes away from maybe the mission and the law by which they're meant to be fighting.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that kind of drift in most tight-knit specialized units, and it can become a serious threat to the system itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those really complex challenges that the military have to deal with. They want to motivate soldiers to fight and be resourceful, but also they want them to be disciplined and obedient. And sometimes those things clash. And that's a really interesting dynamic of military organizations.
Indeed, it is. And it is a weird dynamic. I mean, all soldiers face difficult decisions, but some units even more so, because they're constantly operating in the borderline moral and legal gray area. And that makes it harder to know where exactly to draw the line. I mean, you push people in one direction most of the time, then you expect them to pull back when needed. But how do you ensure that they always stay on the right side? I mean, it's a tough balance. And I've seen many situations where that line gets blurry. And it can be hard to pull back once you have been conditioned to push forward.
It's not new, and certainly, I have evidence in the First World War of units in my grandfather's division killing prisoners and giving orders to kill prisoners. And this is completely, people don't think the British Army did this in the First World War, and they did. They wasn't massive, it wasn't huge, but it certainly happened, and I have evidence to suggest that. And it's, in a way, that's quite shocking. That's very much against, what we think the British Army and Western armies in general are meant to do. But unfortunately, that is war. People kill, and that borderline that you were talking about, Matt, is sometimes very, very difficult to negotiate. And it's so easy for academics like me to sit here and judge people when I've never been in a situation of stress and, where my life could potentially end if I didn't take such action. So it's always very difficult. And, you can understand the motivation of individuals in those situations. And it's very difficult. And so motivation in those places and making the right judgment is such a challenging thing to do.
I think we've seen in the news just recently, and this is really a hot potato, is the inquest about Northern Ireland and, the decision to put that forward to the prosecution authority and, on the SAS. And I think it speaks to your point, it speaks to Max's point. This needs very level and objective discussion. It's such an emotive topic. And, to imagine on all sides, the casualties and then also the people that were placed in that situation with a certain training from a certain background and certain orders. And then this suspicion that Max mentions, that you've mentioned too, Tom, and a little bit, I'll put it out there, I don't have too much evidence on this, but maybe a bit of otherness, right? Like it's us and them kind of style. It often happens, right? But like you've said, it's one that needs, we can't imagine what it can be in one particular context, and it just needs, we need to give it a lot of respect and try to really apply ourselves to understand that specific norm in that moment, right?
And I think motivation is, yes, because motivation by itself is highly dynamic. It's very contextual. It's shaped by many different things on a day, whether you're hungry. If you're hungry and tired, you're completely different from being, rested and full. And, the impact of fatigue on decision-making and motivation is something which, a lot of us don't have any idea of this, because very few of us have actually experienced what hunger and cold is like. And when you're on the Eastern Front in a German or Russian unit, your world is completely different. And I'm not justifying it. I'm just trying to explain it. And, if you're in Northern Ireland, and I live in Northern Ireland, and understanding the dynamics, and the British Army certainly did go off the reservation in several incidents, in Derry, in Londonderry, in Belfast, and they certainly committed acts which were not their finest hour. But it's very difficult, what would I have done if I was in that situation as a scared 18-year-old? It's very difficult. I'm not justifying, but I'm trying to understand it. Maybe poorly.
I agree with you. And I think this is something that leadership, whether governments or military command, has to take seriously. Because this isn't new. It's a well-known factor. Whether you're storming trenches in World War I, dropping into Normandy, or operating in Iraq and Afghanistan, the same fundamental issues exist. The people sending soldiers to war know it can turn into a shitstorm. They know motivation is a double-edged sword, and sometimes it pushes soldiers to go above and beyond, but sometimes it drives them over that edge. And I think the key to managing this isn't just about reacting after the fact. It has to start at the top. Those making the decisions need a better understanding of how to regulate this before, during, and after combat.
Yeah, and again, regulation shapes motivation, because if you normalize, for instance, raping civilians, or you normalize shooting prisoners, as the Soviet and German units did on the Eastern Front, then soldiers will do it. And if you have a command chain that allows that and lets people get away with it, then they will do it, because that is legitimized. Sometimes it's very difficult we were allowed to do it, so we did it. And it's very difficult to say, well, that's what motivated them. But if you have a strong command structure and says, because soldiers do these things, they get drunk, they make mistakes, they shoot people. And that's why you need a rigorous system of justice and investigation to deal with any of these incidents. But also you need clarity about the rules of engagement, which then shapes motivation, because the clearer things are, and it's a lot easier then for soldiers to know what they can and they can't do and shape their responses appropriately. I know that's easier said than done. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I've never been in combat, so, I'm an armchair general in this. Motivation is shaped by what's expected of people as well.
This content doesn't make itself, and we're fueled by cold beer and hot strategy. Buy us around at undergroundstrategy.com/support. It's how legends are made. Now back to it. Yeah, definitely. I mean, most soldiers want to do the right thing. And like you said, clear structures and rules of engagement, they do help a lot. The problem is when the rules are vague or overly broad, like they almost always are. I mean, take Afghanistan. When you have, for example, rules of engagement black, like we had back in the day, it basically meant you could shoot at anything you felt might be a threat to you. And that kind of ambiguity gives you too much wiggle room. And it's easy to start setting new standards for what's acceptable, who lives and who doesn't. And once those boundaries start shifting, it's almost impossible to define where they should stop. But on the other hand, it's a balance, because if the rules are too rigid, you lose the flexibility and that drive that a unit like that needs to be effective.
Yes, and making people clear about what happens if they do commit an incident and what that happens, down the line. If you look at British Army actions in Northern Ireland and trace the individuals who were affected by those and then what they subsequently did, often many of them join Republican or loyalist paramilitary groups because they want to revenge, justice, protect the communities, blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't end the conflict and achieve the mission ends. And it's easy to say that when you're, sitting here in the kitchen and it's a nice Thursday evening. It's not when you're cold, tired, and you're scared. That's a different world. And I think we have to understand that when we look at why people do things.
I think you're absolutely right. And, on that note, Tom, I'm sure our listeners by now want to know where they can find out a little bit more. And you have a book coming out soon. You maybe want to give us a line or two about it. We'll maybe add something in the show notes too, but just give us a little taster.
Well, I've got, at the time of recording, which is in the early spring in 2025, I've got 2 projects on the go. Firstly, I'm producing a set of edited academic essays on the London Regiment, which is a territorial formation which served during the Great War, made up of part-time civilians in London, and created 4 divisions which served across the British Empire and the Western Front. And that looks at all aspects of the London Regiment, from medical services to theatre groups to the learning curve, learning process. My second project then looks at what actually motivates soldiers in the First World War, what motivates the individuals in my grandfather's infantry division to serve or not serve. There's a lot of times when they don't do what they're meant to do, and they go off and get drunk or punch their corporal or things like that. And so I'm trying to look at motivation in a very broader element and then consider, well, what difference does being motivated or unmotivated mean to military outcomes? Does it really matter in warfare, or are there other factors like being able to know what you're doing, for instance, being trained, having the equipment, having the technology, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's a really interesting idea of actually looking at the outcomes on the battlefield. And that's very difficult to do. And I've got my own methodology about doing that. But those are my 2 main projects. After that, I want to look at 2 other areas. Firstly, I want to do a comparative study on the Eastern Front. So looking at Soviet forces and Nazi forces, what motivated them to fight? Because again, I think that is not something that's being looked at in detail. And the comparative study is really interesting because the idea is that the Russians are motivated by fear. The NKVD put machine guns behind the infantry, so they're going to be shot if they go forward or shot if they go back. Is that really true? And were the Nazis motivated by ideology and things like that? So actually looking at those as a comparative factor. And finally, the other project that I want to do after that is looking at the organizational culture of a paramilitary group known as the Auxiliaries. They were used in the War of Irish Independence by British forces serving on the island of Ireland, and they were made up of ex-officers, and they went off the reservation several times. They burnt cork, committed a number of extrajudicial killings, and they're a very, very interesting group because they're relatively well documented. So essentially looking at what shaped their motivation during the, I suppose, 18 months of the War of Independence in the island of Ireland.
That's a lot of good research, books and content.
It's a lot to keep me going for a very long time.
I mean, that's the next 10 years kind of program of work.
Indeed.
But we look forward to having you back. We'd love to welcome you back. As soon as the books are getting out there, we'd love to have you back on a more focused episode on one or two of those projects. And a big thank you from us. And last words to you, Max.
Tom, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure talking to you. I really hope that we can have you back soon because I've got so many more questions for you. But for now, thanks for coming on and sharing your insights. We really appreciate that. And to everyone listening, we hope you have enjoyed this episode because we will be back next week. So take care out there and bye-bye.